Happy February and welcome back to Across the Circus. I'm your host, Alex Hopper, as always. Those of you who are first-time listeners, here at Across the Circus, we cover news abroad and closer to here at home. Before we begin today, I wanted to give you a reminder that it is a cold February, with huge snowstorms wiping across the entire U.S. Keep in mind that the most requested item at every homeless shelter is socks. For those of you who have gone on hikes or served in the military, you know the importance of a fresh pair of socks. Your feet can deteriorate quickly if they're wet, if they're dirty, or if just in general you do not have a pair. So if you're thinking of a way to help your community, go out there and give some homeless people some socks and turn them into some homeless shelters. They're greatly needed during these freezing times. Let's get into the news. Our first story today comes out of Iran, where an Iranian couple have been given 10 years for dancing. The official charge was for promoting corruption, prostitution, and propaganda. The couple stated that their dance was unrelated to the current protests going on in Iran. Both, in their 20s, had their homes raided before their arrests and were taken away from their families. Our second story today comes out of Australia, where luckily a missing radioactive capsule has been located. The radioactive device was lost by mining giant Rio Tinto, who apologized for losing it. The radioactivity of the device is used as a density gauge in the mining industry. While only being the size of a pea, the container is of cesium-137, one of the most dangerous isotopes of radioactivity. Rio Tinto is reimbursing the government for the cost of the search and is very grateful to have found it. In news from Ukraine, the German tanks allotted for the Ukrainians are now on their way to Kiev. The German tanks will be replaced by American tanks in Germany as soon as they arrive. This comes as Russia is now advancing in Ukraine's eastern province of Donetsk. And our final story from abroad, coming out of Russia, Moscow announces that it will no longer allow U.S. inspections of their military sites and will no longer comply with the last remaining nuclear treaty between the U.S. and Russia. Now for something closer to home. Our first story from home today comes out of Washington, D.C., where a man is charged in the shooting of a 13-year-old boy. Jason Mitchell, who's 41, turned himself in after being charged with second-degree murder in the shooting of a 13-year-old Karen Blake on January 7th at 0400. According to Lewis, he left the house with his legally owned gun and heard noises of what he thought was someone trying to get in his house whenever he opened fire. After yelling at the group of teens, a getaway vehicle took off, and Mr. Lewis claims that Karen Blake then ran at him, which some other witnesses affirm. It is at this point that he shot Karen Blake. Immediately after doing so, Karen Blake proclaimed that he was a kid, and Mr. Lewis began doing chest compressions on Blake. He was later pronounced dead in hospital. It is being debated whether it is self-defense or not, but it will ultimately be up to the jury. Our next story from here at home is the Biden administration finally announces to end all COVID-19 restrictions on May 11th. This comes after a huge wave of calls for COVID amnesty after how people treated each other during the COVID-19 pandemic. While one side claims to have been doing the best for their families, the other still feels that they were mistreated for these lockdowns and other forms of discrimination between vaccinated, unvaccinated, and masked and unmasked. And our final story today is the giant ice storm that has been raging through the U.S. for the past 3 days, and possibly more whenever this is released. Thousands are without power in Texas, and 2,300 flights have been canceled due to these outages. The storms have raged through Texas, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, even as far as Alabama. Again, I remind you to look out for those in your community, look for those without power, and find ways to help them, as well as giving the homeless in your community fresh socks, fresh jackets, and making sure that local homeless shelters are all stocked up for the winter to help those around. That has been February's edition of Across the Circus. I've been your host, Alex Hopper. Remember to stay safe, stay informed, and turn off the gas stove before you go to bed. Have a wonderful month, everybody.